January 1945. A pale winter sun hung low over the shattered outskirts of a small German village west of the Rhine. Snow clung to the blackened frames of burned houses. Windows were gone, doors blown open, fields frozen solid under weeks of bitter cold. The war had drained everything: food, warmth, hope. From a distance came the muffled rumble of engines. American trucks, their olive-drab silhouettes, emerged slowly through the drifting frost, tires crunching over debris. German civilians watched from ruined doorways and cellar holes, silent and rigid. Mothers held their children close. Old men leaned on broken fence posts. No one moved. No one breathed too loudly. For years they had been told what these men would do if they ever stepped on a German soil. But when the column halted, something unexpected happened. A young American private climbed down, unbuckled a metal ration tin, and knelt in front of a trembling German child who wore a coat several sizes too large. He opened the tin carefully and placed part of his meal into the child's hands. The villagers froze, unsure whether to fear it, reject it, or believe it. That single gesture would read death. By the winter of 1944 to 45, Germany was collapsing from the inside out. What had once been a tightly controlled, fiercely organized wartime society was now buckling under the combined weight of military defeat, destroyed infrastructure, and the steady advance of Allied armies from both east and west. Every month brought new losses. Every week brought new shortages. And every day brought a growing sense among civilians that the war Hitler promised would never touch German soil had now arrived at their doorsteps with unforgiving force. Cities were shells of their former selves. Cologne, Frankfurt, Stuttgart, and countless smaller towns were scarred by years of strategic bombing. Roofs had vanished, entire districts were reduced to rubble, and streets were lined with cratered tram tracks and shattered brick. Railway stations that once sent soldiers to the front now served as makeshift shelters for displaced families fleeing eastward from the advancing Soviet forces. The smoke that had risen from German factories at the height of the war was gone. In its place drifted the cold dust of destruction. Food was no longer guaranteed. Ration cards were still printed, but the goods they promised rarely appeared. Bread grew thinner each month, stretched with fillers like barley, potatoes, or even ground turnip. Meat became almost mythical. Children searched through ruins for anything edible. Women stood in silent, winding lines outside half-stock stores, hoping to find a few ounces of flour or margarine. Malnutrition was not yet starvation, but it was moving in that direction, especially in regions overrun by refugees. Still, the propaganda machine kept working. Radios crackled with confident proclamations about strategic withdrawals and new weapons that would reverse the war's course. Posters and speeches warned citizens about the advancing Allies, especially American soldiers. The message was clear: the Americans would pillage, desecrate, and punish those who resisted. They would show no mercy to German families. Fear was a tool, and by 1945 it had sunk deep into the civilian psyche. Yet the front lines told a different story. As the Allies crossed into Western Germany after the Battle of the Bulge, they encountered towns already half abandoned by the Wehrmacht. Defenses were thin. Many soldiers were barely old enough to shave or old enough to be grandfathers. Others were Volkssturm, civilians pressed into service with little training and outdated rifles. Few had the will or the means to resist for long. When American forces pushed into the Rhineland, Hesse, and parts of Bavaria and Württemberg, they often found civilians hiding in basements or standing motionless beside damaged buildings, white sheets draped from windows. Some villagers placed their hands behind their heads, expecting abuse or detention. Others clutched their children tightly, bracing for the violence they had been taught to expect. And many simply stared, exhausted, numb, unsure what response the foreign uniforms would bring. This was the atmosphere into which the first exchanges between American soldiers and German civilians unfolded, a space filled with hunger, fear, and silence. For the American troops, Germany was enemy territory, but it was also a place where the war's final chapter was clearly approaching. Many soldiers had fought across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. They had faced ambushes, artillery barrages, and relentless winter fighting. Now, as they entered German towns, they encountered something unexpected: civilians who looked less like enemies and more like survivors of a world collapsing in slow motion. U.S. Army rations, sturdy, predictable, and plentiful, formed a stark contrast to the emptiness of German plates. The K-ration, fielded widely in 1944–45, came neatly boxed with biscuits, canned meat, powdered drinks, chocolate, and sometimes a coveted D-bar. Soldiers were trained to guard their supplies carefully, yet many soon realized that the children staring at them had not eaten properly in days. It created a psychological tension within the ranks, the instinct to help versus the discipline of war. And so, in the last months of the conflict, as American forces moved deeper into Germany, the boundaries between enemy and civilian began to blur. Acts of generosity, cautious, small, and sometimes forbidden, flickered into existence. A tin of stew, a slice of bread, a chocolate bar slipped discreetly to a frightened child. These moments did not end the war, but they changed the way people experienced it, and they began forming the fragile beginnings of a different relationship, one that would reshape entire communities once the fighting stopped. The stage was set for a deeper examination of the world behind these encounters, a world shaped by hunger, misconception, and the slow unraveling of a regime built on fear. The final advance of American forces into Germany unfolded with a mixture of precision, exhaustion, and cautious anticipation. By early 1945, the U.S. Army had learned the rhythms of war intimately. The grinding movement of infantry across ruined towns, the rumble of Sherman tanks along narrow village roads, the distant thunder of artillery softening enemy positions miles ahead. Yet the crossing into Germany brought a new emotional weight. This was not a liberation campaign. This was enemy territory, the heartland of the regime they had fought for years. For many American soldiers, Germany was a place they had imagined long before they stepped onto its soil. Training films had depicted rigid, fanatical defenders. Briefings warned of ambushes in every cellar, traps hidden beneath cobblestones, and civilians ready to signal German units at the first opportunity. Veterans of the Battle of the Bulge carried memories of deception, German soldiers disguised in American uniforms, false road signs, and sudden nighttime assaults. Trust did not come easily. Still, what they encountered in many towns did not match the warnings. Instead of hostile crowds, U.S. patrols often found thin, weary lines of civilians emerging cautiously from basements. Women with hollow eyes, children wrapped in blankets, elderly men trembling from cold and fatigue, all raising their hands slowly to show they carried no weapons. It was not unusual for entire families to approach American checkpoints silently, holding small white cloths or torn bedsheets as improvised flags of surrender. Behind the soldiers, the American supply chain moved like an organized spine. The U.S. Quartermaster Corps had built a logistical network that stretched from French ports to German borders, feeding millions of troops with astonishing consistency. Convoys delivered crates of rations, medical supplies, blankets, and fuel. Even in winter's harshest months, American units generally ate better than the civilians they now encountered. U.S. rations themselves became symbols of contrast. The K-ration, designed for mobility, held compact calories, canned cheese or meat, hard biscuits, powdered drinks, chewing gum, and a famously dense D-bar, a chocolate ration more durable than delicious. The C-ration, more substantial, offered tin stews, beans, or meat with vegetables. To a hungry child, even the smell of a heated C-ration stew could feel overwhelming. German civilians, long accustomed to dwindling portions and ersatz substitutes, were stunned by the abundance packed into a single soldier's meal. And they were even more stunned when some soldiers offered it to them. Yet ration sharing did not begin as a grand policy. It emerged quietly from the ground level, influenced by the instincts of individual soldiers and the unfolding realities around them. The U.S. Army had strict guidelines at first. Supplies were for troops, not civilians, and interactions with Germans were to be limited to prevent fraternization. But by spring 1945, the situation on the ground had shifted. Civilians were no longer a distant enemy. They were immediate, visible, and clearly suffering. The psychological strain on German communities was profound. Years of Nazi propaganda had painted American soldiers as violent, immoral invaders who would show no mercy. Mothers whispered warnings to their children as Allied forces approached. Leaflets and radio broadcasts repeated the same message: expect brutality. But as columns of American soldiers passed through towns and villages, many Germans witnessed scenes that challenged those deeply embedded fears. Some saw medics tending to wounded civilians. Others noticed soldiers handing out cigarettes or chocolate to elderly men. The contradictions were unsettling. It forced civilians to reevaluate everything they had been told. Even so, caution remained on both sides. Many American units were under orders not to encourage dependence among civilians. In heavily contested areas, the risk of hidden enemy fighters or snipers made every interaction potentially dangerous. Soldiers did not forget the unpredictability of war. A friendly smile could still mask a threat, and a collapsing enemy sometimes lashed out in desperation. Over time, however, as the front lines pushed deeper into southern and central Germany, into towns like Aschaffenburg, Göttingen, or Nuremberg, the nature of encounters changed. Resistance diminished. Wehrmacht units surrendered en masse. Civilians were left in limbo, trapped between the ruins of a regime that had controlled their lives and the presence of foreign soldiers they barely understood. It was in this fragile in-between world that small gestures carried heavy meaning. A soldier offering a biscuit, a medic handing a bandage to a frightened mother, a guard at a checkpoint quietly giving a child his spare D-bar. These acts did not erase the devastation of war, but they cut through the propaganda, the mistrust, and the years of separation between two societies. And as these moments accumulated across towns and villages, they formed the foundation for a larger story, one shaped by the intersection of humanity, military policy, and the slow unraveling of a nation at war. In this environment of fear, hunger, and hesitant contact, different perspectives began to emerge, perspectives that reveal the many angles of what happened when American soldiers shared their rations with the very people they had been sent to defeat. For both sides, the meetings between American soldiers and German civilians occurred in a landscape shaped by fear and uncertainty. The war had stripped away the familiar structures of daily life. Schools were closed. Shops were empty. Streets were silent except for the distant echoes of artillery or the grinding approach of armored columns. When civilians finally confronted American troops face to face, the moment carried a heavy emotional charge. Every gesture, every movement of a soldier's hand toward his belt or pocket could determine whether trust or panic followed. Many Americans arrived with their own emotional burdens. They had lost friends in France, Belgium, and Luxembourg. They had fought through the Hürtgen forest, endured the Ardennes winter, and marched past the bodies of comrades who had fallen only days earlier. Their perception of Germany had been forged through years of propaganda, combat, and personal suffering. Then they looked at the civilians standing before them, shivering children, elderly couples carrying small bundles, women with ash-smudged faces, and the image of an enemy dissolved into something far more complex. The human instinct to help often outweighed the instinct to stay guarded. Soldiers who had expected hostility instead saw hunger. They heard trembling voices asking for nothing more than bread or water. And for a moment, war's rigid boundaries softened. For the civilians, the shock was even greater. Many had prepared themselves for violence. Instead, they received a quiet nod or a calm instruction. Some mothers cried not from fear, but from the relief of realizing that the soldiers before them did not intend to harm their children. It was in these fragile, vulnerable moments that American rations, small, simple, utilitarian, became the first connection between two worlds that had only known each other through the lens of hatred. Acts of generosity were not always driven purely by emotion. They also held strategic significance. The U.S. Army understood that occupying a foreign territory required more than military might. It required stability. As front lines advanced and German defensive positions crumbled, soldiers were entering populated areas that could either cooperate or resist. A village that feared American troops might hide enemy stragglers, sabotage equipment, or refuse to comply with basic commands. A village that trusted them was far less likely to become a security concern. Ration sharing, though rarely formalized, became a practical tool. When troops gave away part of their food, it helped calm tensions immediately. A child receiving a chocolate bar did not simply satisfy hunger. It signaled to the adults that these soldiers were not acting as conquerors. It discouraged panic-driven resistance. It encouraged civilians to approach checkpoints openly rather than flee into the woods, where military police might misinterpret their actions. Moreover, U.S. commanders recognized the importance of winning what would later be called hearts and minds. They knew the post-war occupation would demand cooperation. Food shortages were severe, and widespread civilian desperation could easily ignite unrest. Stabilizing regions required careful balancing, showing strength to deter violence, yet showing humanity to prevent desperation from turning into chaos. Even a simple act of a soldier handing out biscuits at a checkpoint could reduce the burden on military patrols. Civilians who felt reassured were less likely to behave unpredictably. And every interaction that ended peacefully meant fewer opportunities for misunderstandings or accidental violence. In this sense, the sharing of rations became an unofficial yet effective component of military strategy, shaping not just individual encounters, but the broader tempo of the occupation as the war neared its end. For years, Nazi propaganda had hammered one message: the Americans were coming to destroy Germany. Newspapers printed lurid stories of cruelty. Radio broadcasts repeated warnings that Allied soldiers would show no mercy. Teachers told children terrifying tales of what would happen if the enemy entered their town. These narratives served a purpose. Fear kept the population obedient. A terrified civilian was less likely to question the war, less likely to resist the regime, and more likely to support total mobilization. But propaganda is fragile when confronted with reality. When American troops entered German towns and behaved contrary to every warning, it destabilized the psychological foundations of the Nazi state. A single soldier handing a ration tin to a child achieved something no leaflet or speech could accomplish. It exposed the regime's lies. Civilians who watched these moments whispered to one another. Their fear began to fracture. Their trust in the government's claims weakened. This did not mean that Germans instantly embraced the American presence. Suspicion remained, especially among those who had lost family members or homes to Allied bombing. Yet the contradiction was impossible to ignore. The stories they had been told, that Americans would slaughter prisoners, abuse women, and burn towns, vanished in the face of calm interactions and unexpected kindness. This collapse of belief spread quickly. German civilians who had once feared to step outside approached American soldiers with questions, requests, or gestures of surrender. In many regions, the breakdown of propaganda was so swift that even members of the Volkssturm abandoned their posts, realizing the regime had lied to them. Ration sharing played a deceptively large role in this transformation. It was not just food. It was proof that the enemy they had been taught to hate might not be the monster they had been raised to imagine. Most American soldiers who entered Germany in 1945 were young men, many barely in their 20s. Their worldview had been shaped by Depression-era hardship, military training, and months of combat that blurred the line between courage and survival. They carried personal memories of loss: a friend killed by a sniper in the Ardennes, a squad mate lost to artillery in the Hürtgen forest, a tank crew burned inside their Sherman outside Metz. These experiences hardened them, but they did not erase their sense of decency. To these soldiers, rations were more than food. They were symbols of home, a taste of ordinary life, a reminder of kitchens, families, and the rhythm of civilian existence waiting for them beyond the war. When they saw German children with sunken eyes or mothers holding infants wrapped in thin blankets, the emotional contrast was sharp. Many soldiers recognized something familiar in those faces, the resemblance to the younger siblings they hadn't seen in years, or the neighbors' children who used to run across front lawns back in Ohio, Kansas, or Pennsylvania. Some soldiers struggled to reconcile the idea of feeding the enemy with their own losses. They had fought fiercely against German forces, seen the cost of resisting every inch of ground. Yet, when faced with civilians who had no connection to the battlefield, their anger often softened. Military discipline governed their actions, but personal values influenced their choices. Many believed instinctively that war should not be directed at children or the helpless. For these soldiers, giving away a biscuit or chocolate bar was not an act of betrayal. It was a declaration of who they were, and of the world they hoped would exist after the fighting ended. German civilians lived under a psychological weight that is difficult to fully grasp today. They had endured years of bombing, strict rationing, political repression, and a constant pressure to display loyalty to a regime that punished dissent. Parents whispered warnings to their children about what would happen when the Americans arrived. Some families prepared small bundles of belongings in case they needed to flee at a moment's notice. Others hid in basements, terrified of what the first encounter might bring. For many civilians, the sight of American soldiers sharing rations created a tidal shift in perception. Mothers who had expected brutality watched in disbelief as soldiers knelt to offer children chocolate or crackers. Elderly men who had been told the Americans would desecrate their towns found themselves receiving cigarettes or hot soup from field kitchens. The shock was profound. It challenged not only their fears, but their understanding of the world beyond Germany's borders. Pride complicated these interactions. Some civilians were hesitant to accept food, viewing it as an admission of defeat or weakness. Yet hunger and exhaustion often overrode hesitation. When a soldier gently extended a ration tin, the gesture carried no triumph or mockery. It was simple, direct, and human. Accepting it meant acknowledging that the world outside their ruined streets might not be governed by the hatred their leaders had preached. These early encounters also revealed deep generational divides. Children often accepted rations eagerly, unburdened by political illusions. Older civilians, raised in a more nationalistic era or influenced heavily by propaganda, accepted help more slowly. But every small act eroded barriers, and within weeks many communities began viewing the Americans less as invaders and more as unfamiliar visitors. Cautious, powerful, yet surprisingly compassionate. War is built on destruction, but individual morality does not always disappear in its shadow. The moments when American soldiers shared their rations with German civilians introduced a moral dimension that contrasted sharply with the brutality surrounding them. These acts existed outside the framework of military objectives or tactical necessity. They were quiet declarations of humanity in a landscape scarred by cruelty and suffering. Ethically, such gestures challenged the traditional understanding of total war. They blurred the distinction between victor and vanquished. When a soldier handed food to a starving child, he was not serving a strategic goal alone. He was acknowledging the shared vulnerability of human life. It demonstrated that, even amid devastation, compassion could survive. These interactions also held moral significance for the civilians who witnessed them. For years, they had been taught to view Americans as ruthless enemies. When soldiers acted kindly, it forced civilians to confront the gap between ideology and reality. This confrontation created an internal moral reckoning. Many Germans had supported or tolerated the Nazi regime without questioning its narratives. Seeing the enemy behave with humanity triggered self-reflection about the moral foundations of their own society. In the broader context of the war, such acts did not erase atrocities or undo suffering. But they provided a glimpse of what could come after the guns fell silent. A future built not on revenge, but on the rebuilding of trust. Ration sharing became a symbol of that shift, a reminder that even when nations are torn apart, individuals retained the power to choose empathy over hatred. By March and April of 1945, the American advance into Western and Southern Germany had accelerated. The Ruhr industrial region, once the powerhouse of German production, was collapsing under encirclement. Wehrmacht divisions were surrendering by the thousands. Civilians, caught between retreating German forces and advancing Allied troops, found themselves navigating a shifting and unpredictable landscape. It was during these critical weeks that some of the most documented, transformative encounters occurred. These were not symbolic moments created after the war. They were recorded in unit diaries, soldier letters, Red Cross reports, and occupation records. And many began the same way, with hunger. In towns like Remagen, Gießen, and Aschaffenburg, American infantry units moved street by street, clearing pockets of resistance before securing key intersections. Once the shooting stopped, civilians emerged cautiously from basements. Some carried white cloths. Others approached with their hands forward, trembling. Children watched from behind collapsed walls, unable to gauge whether the danger had truly passed. The Americans, weary from weeks of fighting, were drawn instantly to the visible signs of deprivation. Thin faces, ripped clothing, children with hands stained from picking through rubble. It was in these first quiet minutes after the firing ended that the emotional weight of the moment crystallized. A battlefield could turn silent in an instant, but the silence of a starving population carried a different gravity. One of the earliest documented incidents occurred near Boppard on the west bank of the Rhine. A patrol of the 87th Infantry Division encountered a cluster of civilians sheltering in a barn. The American lieutenant noted in his after-action report that the group included several children showing signs of prolonged malnutrition. Regulations stated that rations were to be conserved, but the patrol, having just completed a night march, opened their K-ration boxes and divided the biscuits and cheese among the children. The report's final line was concise. Civilians showed no resistance, appeared grateful, areas secured without incident. It was a small gesture, but it revealed the connection between humanitarian instinct and immediate tactical calm. In the same period, field kitchens became focal points of contact. These mobile units, designed to feed hundreds of soldiers, often arrived in newly secured towns shortly after combat operations concluded. Their distinctive scent, hot stew, meat, vegetables, drifted through streets where homes had not produced warm food in months. Civilians gathered at a distance, drawn by the aroma, but unsure whether approaching would provoke anger. American cooks, accustomed to feeding entire companies, sometimes found themselves serving a parallel line of civilians after receiving informal approval from commanding officers. One such moment occurred near Würzburg in early April. The city had suffered severe destruction, and its population was desperate. When the 12th Armored Division set up a temporary kitchen in the outskirts, dozens of children approached quietly, standing in a loose semicircle. The cooks initially waved them back, unsure of their orders. But after a sergeant observed several children trying to catch the steam in their hands for warmth, he instructed his men to prepare a supplemental pot of thin soup. The entry in the division's logbook described the scene simply. Civilians, mostly children, fed. No disturbance. Morale improved. In some towns, the turning point came not from a kitchen, but from a single soldier carrying his rations on patrol. One private from the 4th Armored Division, stationed near Tauberbiskofsheim, encountered a group of orphans scavenging for food among collapsed market stalls. He later wrote in a letter home that he gave the youngest child his D-bar and watched as the child held it like a treasure, not eating it at first, just staring at it. The private added that the moment felt strange, like giving away a piece of home to someone who had none. These encounters, repeated across dozens of towns, chipped away at the last remnants of Nazi fear narratives. Civilians who had braced for violence found compassion instead. Mothers who had been hiding children since the first artillery shells landed now allowed them to step forward to receive food. Elderly men who had once shouted slogans from party rallies stood silently in line behind children waiting for a piece of American bread. The transition from fear to cautious trust was not instantaneous. Some civilians still hesitated to take food, uncertain whether there would be consequences. Others accepted rations, but kept their distance, unsure how American generosity fit into the larger realities of war. But the emotional shift was undeniable. Every meal shared created ripples through a community, altering its understanding of the occupiers and reducing the likelihood of tension or resistance. These encounters also marked a turning point for many soldiers. The war was not over, but the enemy before them was no longer a faceless force. It was a weary civilian population struggling to survive amid the ruins. Soldiers who had been trained to fight found themselves navigating a different kind of battlefield, one where compassion carried consequences just as meaningful as their weapons. In towns from the Moselle Valley to the edges of Bavaria, the pattern repeated. Contact, caution, hunger, then the quiet, steady exchange of rations that redefined relationships one meal at a time. And as April unfolded, these small acts began converging into larger, more organized efforts, setting the stage for a decisive shift in the relationship between American forces and German civilians. As April 1945 progressed, the American advance penetrated deeper into the heart of southern and central Germany. The front lines were no longer sharply drawn. Wehrmacht units dissolved into scattered pockets, often surrendering without coordinated resistance. With each mile, the focus shifted from combat operations to stabilization, from advancing toward military objectives to managing the presence of hundreds of thousands of civilians suddenly left without a functioning government. It was during this phase that ration sharing evolved from isolated gestures into a broader, more recognized phenomenon. While it still lacked formal institutional backing, commanders increasingly understood that food distribution could calm entire regions more effectively than additional patrols or stricter curfews. American leaders were not acting out of sentimentalism. They were responding to the realities on the ground. Hunger was a volatile force. A starving population, even one defeated in war, could become unpredictable. The turning point came in Bavaria and Thuringia, where American forces encountered some of the most severe civilian deprivation. Towns like Weimar, Bamberg, and Schweinfurt bore the scars of multiple bombing raids and the final clashes of retreating German forces. Food stores were either destroyed or hopelessly depleted. Families lived day to day on thin soups and whatever root vegetables they could salvage from frozen fields. American military intelligence noted the desperation. In reports sent to headquarters, officers described children approaching convoys with open hands, entire families waiting silently near supply depots, and elderly residents collapsing from weakness. These observations were not just humanitarian concerns. They were indicators of the fragile state of the regions now under American control. In response, field commanders began authorizing controlled distribution of Army food. It started with the simplest decisions, allowing civilians to gather leftover stew from field kitchens, instructing supply sergeants to set aside a portion of non-essential items, or giving medical units permission to distribute vitamin tablets and canned fruit to malnourished children. The shift was subtle but meaningful. One documented incident occurred near Weimar shortly after the liberation of the nearby concentration camp at Buchenwald. American troops stationed in the area encountered hundreds of civilians who had been displaced during the final days of the war. Many were wandering the roads in search of relatives or places to shelter. When food shortages became apparent, the 80th Infantry Division set up a temporary feeding point using surplus rations. The action was brief and limited, but reports noted a visible reduction in civilian unrest as a result. Another turning point unfolded near Regensburg, where the 99th Infantry Division established checkpoints at the city's entrances. Soldiers observed increasing numbers of civilians approaching with small makeshift containers, pots, cups, pieces of metal shaped into bowls. The division's commander eventually approved a controlled, once-daily distribution of thin soup prepared by the field kitchen. While the quantities were small, the psychological impact was large. Civilians viewed the gesture not as charity, but as an indication that the Americans intended to maintain order without cruelty. Perhaps the most symbolic transformation came in the smaller villages scattered across Franconia and Swabia. In these rural communities, American soldiers often billeted in farmhouses or stayed in temporary camps on the outskirts. The interaction between troops and residents was more intimate. Soldiers performing perimeter patrols passed children sitting on doorsteps. Families offered snow to soldiers heating their rations, hoping to melt it for boiling. In return, soldiers sometimes shared their hot meals. One sergeant from the 26th Infantry Division recorded in his diary a moment near Bad Kissingen. "We set up the kitchen in a barnyard. The line for chow was long as always. When we finished, a few local kids stood near the gate, staring at the pot. The cooks scraped the bottom and handed them what was left. You'd think they'd been given gold the way they held the bowls." These small interactions carried cumulative power. They began rewriting the social contract between occupier and civilian. Fear gave way to guarded hope. Suspicion softened into cautious gratitude. Civilians who had once relied on whispered rumors now relied on direct experience. Moreover, these moments revealed a deeper truth. American soldiers, despite the trauma of war, were capable of distinguishing between the regime they were fighting and the people caught beneath it. They understood instinctively, sometimes more clearly than politicians, that punishing civilians for the decisions of their government would not bring peace. The climax of this transformation reached its peak in late April and early May, as Germany's surrender approached. In many towns, American field kitchens became informal gathering places. Soldiers distributed small amounts of food, sometimes under supervision, sometimes simply because it felt necessary. Reports from a military government described unexpectedly cooperative civilian behavior in regions where troops had shared rations. By the time word spread that Germany had capitulated, countless civilians had already redefined their perception of the Americans, not because of speeches or proclamations, but because of the simple experience of being fed in a moment of hardship. And as the war ended, these early humanitarian encounters set the stage for a new chapter, one defined not by conquest, but by the enormous responsibility of rebuilding a shattered nation. Germany's surrender in May 1945 did not bring instant relief. It brought a new kind of silence, one filled not with artillery or aircraft engines, but with uncertainty. Cities were ruined landscapes of collapsed roofs, shattered bridges, and broken water lines. Roads were clogged with refugees searching for homes that no longer existed. And everywhere, the question hung in the air, what now? For civilians in the American occupation zones, the earliest signs of the post-war order came not through grand announcements, but through the routines of the soldiers now stationed among them. Many of these troops had already formed human connections during the final weeks of the advance, connections forged through the simple act of sharing food. These interactions now shaped the tone of the occupation. In the first months after the surrender, the U.S. Army faced an immense responsibility, feeding millions of civilians while still supplying its own forces. Even with strict policies, the lines between Army rations and civilian survival often blurred. American officers filed reports describing families waiting at the edges of military camps, hoping for leftovers or permission to collect scraps from refuse pits. In practice, many units began implementing orderly systems for this, turning informal kindness into controlled, predictable routines. The Diaries of American Soldiers offer a vivid window into these early days. A private from the 1st Infantry Division wrote in June 1945 that he had begun setting aside part of his breakfast each morning for 2 German boys who appeared at the gate of his outpost. "They don't talk much," he wrote. "Just nod and smile. It feels like the right thing to do." Similar accounts appear across units, from cooks ladling thin stew into civilian pots, to medics giving vitamin tablets to malnourished children, to officers authorizing limited food distributions in heavily affected areas. For German civilians, these early gestures held enormous weight. They had expected retribution. Instead, they encountered structure and restraint. Military police established curfews and guidelines, but they did not permit looting or revenge attacks. American units guarded food depots, not only against theft but also to ensure equitable distribution. Many civilians were stunned to discover that the soldiers occupying their towns enforced order even when it protected Germans from other desperate Germans. This shift in perception appears repeatedly in German diaries and post-war testimonies. A schoolteacher in Hesse wrote that she could not understand why the Americans did not punish us for what our leaders had done, while a farmer from Bavaria recalled the moment when an American corporal ordered several soldiers to help repair his barn roof after a storm. He said we needed shelter more than they needed rest, the farmer wrote. I had never seen an enemy behave like that. Food remained the central theme of these encounters. Hunger shaped daily life. Rationing under the occupation was strict, and shortages continued well into the later 1940s. But the emotional memory of those first months, the memory of receiving a piece of bread from a soldier who had every reason to hate them, left a deep imprint. For many German civilians, it was the first hint that the world outside Germany might not be as hostile as they had been taught to believe. The Americans, for their part, also benefited from the stability created by these early humanitarian acts. Regions where soldiers had built trust through controlled ration sharing experienced fewer incidents of unrest or sabotage. Civilians were more willing to follow instructions, more open to cooperating with local military governments, and more likely to volunteer information about hidden weapons, Nazi loyalists, or unexploded ordnance. Humanitarian contact translated directly into operational calm. By late summer 1945, as military government offices expanded throughout the occupation zones, the small gestures of the final months of the war had already established a foundation for the broader reconstruction effort. They had shown civilians that the Americans intended to rebuild, not to ravage. And they had shown soldiers that compassion could accomplish what force alone could not. These early months shaped the world that came next, a world moving slowly from survival toward recovery. As the occupation settled into structure and routine, the United States faced a monumental challenge, stabilizing a defeated nation while preventing humanitarian collapse. The destruction left by the war had crippled Germany's ability to feed itself. Fields were damaged, livestock numbers were depleted, railway lines remained broken, and key industrial centers were ruins of twisted metal. Even with strict rationing, the available food supply was insufficient for a population of tens of millions. Recognizing the severity of the situation, American military authorities began coordinating with emerging civilian agencies and international organizations. One of the earliest significant developments was the involvement of UNRRA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. Though primarily focused on displaced persons, UNRRA personnel worked closely with U.S. forces to identify areas where hunger was most acute and where supplemental assistance could prevent widespread mortality. At the same time, local military governments issued directives aimed at stabilizing food distribution. They organized rationing offices, monitored harvests, and imposed strict controls on grain storage. American patrols protected farms from theft, ensuring that crops reached official warehouses instead of disappearing into black markets. The priority was clear: prevent famine at all costs, even if it meant diverting resources from military stockpiles. A major turning point arrived with the introduction of care packages beginning in 1946. Though outside the immediate wartime period, these packages became a symbol of American aid. Soldiers were no longer the primary bridge between the U.S. supply system and starving civilians. Now, entire organizations were dedicated to relief. A single care parcel could contain canned meats, powdered milk, sugar, chocolate, margarine, coffee, and soap. For families who had survived on thin bread and potatoes, these parcels were a revelation. German newspapers often described them as the first sign of normal life. And yet, the emotional foundation for this aid had been laid earlier. During those first, tentative exchanges in 1945, when soldiers quietly opened their rations to civilians who had feared them. The U.S. military government also recognized that the psychological dimension of hunger could not be ignored. Feeding programs did more than fill stomachs. They signaled that the war's brutality was giving way to a new order, one based on rules, reconstruction, and the possibility of cooperation. In reports sent to Washington, military governors emphasized that regions where civilians had early positive contact with American troops remained the most stable. Local German administrations began to rebuild under American supervision. Mayors were appointed, police forces reorganized, and food distribution centers established in schools, town halls, and church basements. Many of the civilians who staffed these positions had themselves been recipients of American aid only months earlier. The transformation was striking. In a matter of months, civilians who had once hidden from American uniforms began working alongside them. Farmers sought U.S. assistance to protect livestock from disease outbreaks. Teachers asked for American supplies to reopen classrooms. Bakers requested flour from military reserves to revive local bread production. Each interaction deepened the sense that the occupation was not an extension of war, but a step toward redefining their lives. Ultimately, the memory of American soldiers sharing rations became part of a larger narrative, a narrative that helped reshape German attitudes toward the United States in the immediate post-war era. Many Germans later described their first contact with American food as symbolic of a broader transformation, the moment when the enemy became a protector and the occupier became a partner in survival. This shift did not erase the devastation of the war or the suffering it caused, nor did it overshadow the darker complexities of occupation, but it added a human dimension often lost in the scale of global conflict. It showed that even in the ruins of total war, small acts carried extraordinary influence. They helped stabilize communities, calm tensions, and soften the transition from defeat to rebuilding. By the time the Marshall Plan emerged in 1948, bringing large-scale economic assistance to Europe, the foundation for cooperation had already been formed. German civilians remembered the American soldiers who had offered their rations not as conquerors, but as human beings. And it was this memory, rooted in the hunger and uncertainty of 1945, that helped shape the early relationship between a defeated Germany and a rising American presence in Europe. When the war in Europe ended, it left behind a continent scarred by destruction and haunted by memory. The ruins of 1945 stretched across Germany like a physical reminder of the violence that had reshaped the world. And yet, within those same ruins, a different kind of story had taken root, one not about battles or armies, but about small human choices made in moments when compassion outweighed fear. The simple act of sharing rations did not change the course of the war. It did not rebuild cities or erase years of devastation, but it revealed something essential about human nature, that even in the darkest conditions, individuals can choose to behave with dignity. American soldiers were not trained to be humanitarian workers, yet many recognized instinctively that the civilians before them, frightened, hungry, uncertain, were victims of circumstances far larger than themselves. For German civilians, those first bites of American food carried emotional meaning far beyond nourishment. They contradicted the propaganda that had shaped their understanding of the outside world. They forced a reevaluation of beliefs and fears. And for many, that moment became the beginning of a long, difficult journey toward rebuilding not only their homes, but their relationship with the wider world. History often records wars in terms of strategies, operations, and leaders. But wars are also shaped by quiet gestures that rarely enter official archives. A soldier opening a ration tin, a mother accepting soup with trembling hands, a child tasting chocolate for the first time in years. These moments did not end up in diplomatic treaties or military orders. Yet they played a role in softening the transition from conflict to peace. The generosity shown during those early encounters did not erase the suffering of the war, but it planted something important in its aftermath: trust. And trust, fragile as it may be, is the first building block of any future. In the end, The story of American soldiers sharing their rations with German civilians reminds us that history is not only shaped on battlefields, but also in the quiet spaces between them, in the choices individuals make when confronted with the suffering of others, and in the humanity that survives even when everything else has been lost.